The following information is from JesusNeverExisted.com. Ladies and gentlemen, Christianity was the ultimate product of religious syncretism in the ancient world. Now you may be asking yourself, what is syncretism? Well, ladies and gentlemen, if you go to dictionary.com, it says that it's the attempted reconciliation or union of different or opposing principles, practices, or parties, as in philosophies or religion. So, essentially everything that's in the Christian church is taken from other sources, and we're going to be discussing that. You see, when Rome took over Egypt in 30 BC, the Greeks lost their position as the country's ruling elite, and so they increasingly adopted the customs of the native Egyptians. The Egyptians, always at the bottom of the social hierarchy, were taxed even more by the Romans than by the Greeks. Worse yet, with the whole country reduced to the personal fiefdom of an absentee landlord called Caesar, they were bereft of their pharaonic god-king. Deeply religious, they were forced into a religious revisionism to find a new godhead for their ancient theology. Into the heady mix went the Jews, for centuries a volatile minority, especially in Alexandria. Infused by emigres after the fall of the temple in 70, the whole Jewish community had been decimated following the rebellion of 115 through 117. But then a new wave of Jewish migrants and slaves arrived in Egypt after the war in Palestine of 135. Among all these displaced and disoriented races moved the agents of diverse cults and mystery religions, competing for membership and stealing each other's ideas. The most successful cult of all, the supreme example of syncretism, was Christianity. Now, the Greeks created a god called Serapis. The first Greek pharaoh wanted a single composite god to bring together his diverse subjects, in a classic example of the process of syncretism. The character and characteristics of several earlier gods were rolled into one, the god Serapis. In the 3rd century BC, the worship of Serapis became a state-sponsored cult throughout Egypt. With the Roman conquest, the cult spread throughout the empire. Some of these gods that were composited in order to create Serapis was Osiris. Osiris was a major Egyptian deity and king of the underworld. He began his long career as a god of agriculture and nature during the 5th dynasty in 2465 through 2323 BC. Hades was another one. He was the Greek god of the underworld. Also Dionysus, Greek god of agriculture and wine. And Apis was also included, and Apis was the god of Memphis. A bull was chosen for the distinct marks on his body, and was considered to have been born by a virgin cow impregnated by the local creator god Ptah, the local trinity Ptah, Sokar, and Osiris. And Serapis embodied all of these earlier deities. The Ptolemies intended that the new god should have universal appeal in an increasingly cosmopolitan country. In consequence, Serapis had more than 200 localized names, including, and according to the correspondence of Emperor Hadrian, the name Christ. Now here's a quote from Hadrian Servanius in 134 AD. Egypt, which you commended to me, my dearest Servanius, I have found to be wholly fickle and inconsistent, and continually wafted about by every breath of fame. The worshippers of Serapis here are called Christians, and those who are devoted to the god Serapis, I find, call themselves bishops of Christ. The reference is intriguing. In the cult of Serapis, Greco-Roman and Pharaonic religion had already mingled. The cult of Lord Serapis was of comparatively recent origin, having been established by the former general of Alexander, Ptolemy I Soter. His new god had replaced the more recent linked Egyptian gods Osiris and Apis, and formed part of an Egyptian trinity, shared with Isis, the mother, and Horus, the divine child. Ptolemy's idea was to have a unifying national god worshipped by all his subjects. Accordingly, Serapis had been given characteristics drawn from both Egyptian and Greek deities. The child Horus, it should be noted, was held to have been born in a stable on December 25th, and the mother Isis to have been a virgin. For the Egyptians, Horus had been a god of the underworld and judge of the dead, One of the many titles that would be given to Christ was Judge, the celestial arbiter on the Day of Judgment. Major temples for the god Serapis were built at Alexandria and Memphis. The Serapeum in Alexandria was one of the grandest monuments of pagan civilization. This vast complex of buildings itself blended Egyptian giganticism with the grace and beauty of the Hellenic. Now, you might be wondering what it means for something to be Hellenic. If you go to dictionary.com and look up the word Hellenic, it means of pertaining to or characteristics of the ancient Greeks or their language, culture, thought, and etc., especially before the time of Alexander the Great. Of all the Pharaonic or Greek gods, Serapis survived the longest, well into the Roman period. In infusing the character of so many gods into Serapis, the practice of virtual monotheism was established in Alexandria over several hundred years. Now, when the Greeks moved into Egypt, they began to collect ideas from the Egyptians. From the reign of the first Ptolemy in the 4th century BC, the Greeks planted Hellenic culture in Egypt, but far from Hellenizing this ancient land. To a great extent, the Greeks were Egyptianized by the conquered. This process accelerated after the Roman takeover, when the Greeks lost their dominant position. In fact, in the 1st to the 4th century AD, the Greeks kicked out cremation. The Egyptian Greeks, who traditionally had believed in immortality only of the soul, abandoned cremation and adopted Egyptian mummification and the optimistic belief in a resurrection of the body, a notion that fed into early Christianity. The portraiture affixed to their mummies showed Roman clothes and jewelry, but stylistically is Greek. The Romans created a god called Antinos. Now, first of all, let me talk about the death of Antinos. What perhaps should have been a relaxed sojourn on the Nile turned into a personal tragedy for a man named Hadrian, and an event of unimaginable consequence for the world. His male lover, a beautiful Greek youth called Antinos, his companion of several years, drowned in odd circumstances in the Nile. Inconsolable, he had a vast new sanctuary city, Antinopolis, built where the incident had occurred. Modeled on Athens, the ruins of Antinopolis were still visible in the 9th century. The city had a Christian bishop in the 2nd century and 2 rival ones in the 3rd. Convinced that Antinopolis had died but was reborn a god, Hadrian instituted a new religion for his worship, complete with temples and annual games. The core belief was that this virtuous young man, by self-sacrifice, had conquered death and now offered similar salvation and protection to others. An epitaph for Antinos recounts that he had appeared after death in dreams to provide cures for the sick. He was an authentic Greek hero, a human who had attained immortality and could intercede with the gods. With official sponsorship and encouragement, his shrines, images, and priesthoods appear throughout the empire, except in Antioch. In the 4th century, reworked statues of Antinos showed him holding the grapes of Dionysus in one hand and a cross in the other. So, with Hadrian, having been a deeply pious man, interceded the drowning of his lover in religious terms. According to Egyptian tradition, the death in the Nile had been a saving sacrifice, ensuring the continued well-being of Hadrian himself. The corpse of Antinos was not cremated, but embalmed. Shortly after, in the 130s AD, the worship of Antinos became a state-sponsored cult throughout the empire. Meanwhile, Christian scribes were writing their Gospels. Now, if any of you doubt the information that is in this Syncretism series, then please do feel free to research it yourself. So thank you for your time, ladies and gentlemen. Another episode of Syncretism is just around the corner.